The town was called Williams, Arizona. The year was 1882. Wyatt Earp was 34 years old, and he was about to discover that justice has an expiration date. He rode in from the east on a Tuesday. Not because Tuesdays meant anything, because that was the day the stage came through, and he had business with a man who owed money to a widow in Tombstone. He did not know yet that this ride would be the last time he wore a badge with the law's permission. The town sat in the dirt like it was waiting for something that never arrived. 2 streets, a telegraph office, a constable who looked like he had stopped believing in the badge years ago but kept wearing it out of habit. The kind of town where the sun punished everything it touched. Wyatt tied his horse outside the combination saloon and walked inside. He was not there for trouble. He was there to collect a debt. But the men inside looked at him the way men look at a problem that has been solved, like they already knew how this ended. 3 weeks earlier, Virgil Earp had been shot in the back in a dark alley in Cochise County. His left arm shattered by a shotgun blast from an angle no lawman should have been caught facing. Morgan Earp had been killed in his own room, 2 bullets through the window, the curtains still drawn. And now there was only Wyatt, riding between towns that had once called him a hero, wondering what the word still meant. This is the story of the last town Wyatt Earp ever walked into as a lawman, and what he found there that broke something in him no one could name. If these stories find you, subscribe. The West has more ghosts than we have time to tell. Every town has a memory it does not discuss in daylight. Williams, Arizona in 1882 remembered a rancher named John Maloney, who had been dragged behind his own wagon for 3 miles after disputing a land grant with men who had bought the paperwork. The constable had written accident in his logbook. No one had argued with the finding. The town had moved on. That was the kind of town it was. Wyatt walked into the combination saloon and ordered coffee. Not whiskey, coffee. He had learned years earlier that men who ordered coffee in saloons were remembered as either fools or the ones you did not try. He had been both at different times. Today he was collecting for the widow he had promised to protect in Tombstone, a promise he had made before the bullets took Morgan and shattered Virgil's arm, and sent James and Warren fleeing north with their lives as the only inheritance the family had left. The man he was looking for was named Fowler, George Fowler, cattle broker, owed $1,100 to a widow named Sarah Harris, whose husband had been killed by a cattle stampede that some said was not an accident. Wyatt had investigated that stampede. He knew what he knew, and he had told Sarah Harris he would see her debt collected. That was before Tombstone. Before the embalmers came for Morgan in the middle of the night. Before Wyatt understood that keeping a promise in the West meant riding until you found the man who owed, and making him understand the weight of the words. Men at the bar watched him drink. They did not know who he was. That was the first warning sign. In a territory where a man's name still meant something, anonymity was either a gift or an indicator that the town had been picked clean of people who cared. Wyatt finished the coffee, placed a nickel on the bar, did not leave a tip. Men who knew what they were doing in towns like this did not linger. He found Fowler in a back room playing cards with 2 men whose hands never touched their guns. They always touched their guns. That was how you knew. Fowler was a thin man with thin hair and thin convictions. He looked up when Wyatt entered, and the color left his face in a way that confirmed everything Wyatt needed to know about whether this debt was real. Wyatt Earp, Fowler said. The name carried the weight of a history the town had only heard stories about. The gunfight at the OK Corral. 3 dead Clantons and brothers, and a reputation that had traveled west faster than any telegraph could carry it. But reputations were strange things in towns like Williams. They arrived with the man missing. The stories were always bigger than the man who had lived them, and men who had heard the stories always assumed the stories were the thing that mattered. The truth was different. The truth was that Wyatt had shot 3 men in 30 seconds in a corridor so narrow his ears rang for a week from the concussion of the close walls. The truth was that he had not slept through the night since. The truth was that he was still riding because he did not know what else to do with hands that had learned to do only one thing well. "I am here for $1,100, Wyatt said. He did not sit. Sitting in these rooms meant something. He preferred to stand. Fowler looked at his cards and then at the 2 men. The 2 men looked at Wyatt with the particular stillness that precedes violence when it is decided to wait for permission. "That widow," Fowler said. "I owe her nothing." "You owe her $1,100, Wyatt said. "Her husband was killed. The debt is documented. I have the papers." "Papers can be lost," one of the men said. He had not introduced himself. He did not need to. Wyatt looked at him. The man was young, under 30. The kind of young man who believed violence was a conversation he had already learned. The kind who had not yet discovered that conversations have consequences, and consequences travel further than bullets. "The law will hear about this," the young man said. "The law," Wyatt said. "Which part of the law are you referring to?" The silence that followed was the kind that exists in the space between men who understand exactly what the other is capable of, and are calculating whether this is the moment the calculation ends in blood. Fowler broke the silence. "He can pay," he told his companions, "but not today. Give me 30 days. Wyatt did not move. He had heard 30 days before. In this territory, 30 days was how long it took for a man to ride out and return with reinforcements, or a lawyer, or a judge whose signature could be purchased for the right number of cattle. 30 days was a negotiation tactic disguised as a payment schedule. Wyatt had used it himself. He knew what it was. "The widow has waited long enough," Wyatt said. "I will return in 3 days, the full amount, or I will return with a different understanding of how debts are collected in this territory." He walked out. He did not look back. Men who look back in these situations were telling their enemies that they expected trouble and were already preparing to run. Wyatt did not run. He had spent too many years running from one town to another, chasing the memory of what he had been and failing to find it in any of them. The walk back to his horse took 30 seconds. The sun was at its highest point, punishing the street with a light that made everything look like it was happening in a dream. A dog crossed the road ahead of him without looking. The town moved with the slowness of places that have decided that nothing new will ever arrive, and so nothing needs to be hurried. He untied his horse and swung into the saddle. 3 days. That was what he had given Fowler. 3 days to produce $1,100, or understand that the next conversation would not be about money. He did not know yet that the 3 days would be the end of everything he had believed about what a lawman was supposed to be. Fowler tried to speak. The words did not come. His hand moved toward the table, and Wyatt saw a piece of paper there, and picked it up and read the words that were written in a hand that was precise and deliberate, and designed to be read by exactly one person. "Tell Earp the debt is paid. Tell him we remember what happened in Tombstone, and we do not forget what happens to men who interfere with business that is not theirs." Wyatt read the note a second time, then a third. Then he folded it and placed it in his coat pocket, and turned back to Fowler, who was struggling to breathe, and whose eyes had begun the slow roll that precedes unconsciousness, when the body has decided that the effort of staying awake is no longer worth the cost. "Who sent them?" Wyatt said. But Fowler had already slipped into the space between breathing and not breathing, and the only sound in the kitchen was the wind against the window and the distant call of a crow that had found something dead in a field somewhere and was sharing the location with others of its kind. Wyatt left the house. He did not report the crime. He did not go to the constable. He understood that the constable was part of the arrangement that had made Fowler visible to the men who wanted him dead. A constable who wrote accident on a logbook for a man who had been dragged behind a wagon. A constable who did not ask questions because the answers always cost more than the curiosity. A constable who watched Wyatt ride into town and watched him ride back in, and said nothing because saying something meant choosing a side, and choosing a side in this territory meant eventually answering to the men who had already decided which side they owned. He mounted his horse. He sat in the saddle for a long time. He looked at the town that had watched him arrive and would watch him leave, and would remember nothing by the next sunset, because towns like this could not afford to remember. Memory was dangerous. Memory meant you knew what had happened, and knowing meant you were a target. Something broke in Wyatt Earp that day, not his body, his understanding. He had believed that the law was a system that could be trusted to function if a man functioned within it. That if you wore the badge and did the work and collected the debts and protected the widows and spoke the words that the law required you to speak, the law would protect you in return. That the system was designed to reward the man who played by the rules. He understood now that the system was the rule, that the law was not a protection but a structure, and structures could be purchased by men with money and cattle and the willingness to stab 3 times into a man's chest in a kitchen while he begged for air. The ride back to Tombstone took 4 days. He did not stop in other towns. He did not seek company. He rode and thought and understood that the thing he had been looking for his entire life did not exist. There was no justice. There was only power, and the men who had it and the men who were trying to take it from them. And somewhere in between were the people like Sarah Harris, who waited for a man on a horse to fix what could not be fixed, and did not know that the man on the horse was riding toward the same darkness they were trapped in. He delivered the $1,100 to Sarah Harris. He did not tell her what had happened to Fowler. He told her the debt was collected and the matter was closed, and she should use the money to buy land somewhere far from the territories where the word law still meant something. She took the money and thanked him, and he accepted the thanks without feeling that he deserved them. He went to see Virgil. Virgil was in a boarding house on Fremont Street, recovering from the arm that had been shattered by the shotgun blast. He could not work. He could not ride. He could barely dress himself without assistance. The arm was a ruin that would never heal properly, and Virgil knew it, and Wyatt knew it, and neither of them said anything about it because there was nothing to say. The arm was gone. The career was gone. The future that Virgil had imagined when he signed up to be a lawman in a town called Tombstone was gone. All that remained was the memory of what had been, and the question of what came next. "The vigilantes are coming," Virgil said. "I have heard the word. Men in California who have been paid to finish what the Clantons started. They will not stop with lawsuits and lawyers. They want blood. Morgan's blood. Your blood. Possibly mine." Wyatt sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked at the wall. He looked at the bandage on Virgil's arm that was yellow with infection, and heard the words that Virgil was saying, and understood that this was the end of something that had started in a narrow corridor with 3 dead bodies, and would end in the desert with 3 dead men, or 3 dead lawmen, or some combination of the two that the territory would call justice or murder, depending on who was writing the history. "I am leaving," Wyatt said. He did not explain further. He did not need to. Virgil understood. Virgil had always understood. They had grown up together. They had learned to ride together. They had learned to shoot together, and to read the silence of rooms together, and to understand that the law was a conversation between men who had decided to pretend it meant something. Virgil understood that Wyatt was leaving because staying meant dying, and dying meant nothing if the vigilantes won, and it meant nothing anyway if they lost. The mathematics did not work. The only equation that solved was the one that said ride away and do not look back. "Do what you need to do," Virgil said. "I will manage." They did not shake hands. They did not embrace. The Earp brothers had never been men who used their bodies to express what their words could not carry. They sat in the room and the sun moved across the floor, and outside the window the town of Tombstone went about the business of being a town that had already forgotten Morgan Earp and was waiting to forget the rest of them. Wyatt rode north. He did not say goodbye to Josephine. He left a note that said he was going to find work in the mining towns and would write when he could, and that she should not wait. She read the note and understood what it meant. She had known Wyatt long enough to know that when he left, and that the leaving was not about her, but about the thing inside him that could not stop moving, because stopping meant feeling, and feeling meant confronting the silence of a room where Morgan had died, and Virgil had lost his arm, and the law had revealed itself to be nothing more than the men who owned it. He worked in the mines in Colorado for 8 months. He did not use his real name. He worked as a ranch hand in Wyoming for 6. He punched cattle and slept in barns and ate food that tasted like salt and sawdust, and woke up every morning to a sky that did not care whether he lived or died. He learned to become invisible. He learned to move through the world without leaving a mark that could be followed. He became the kind of man who walks into a town and walks out, and no one remembers the face because there was nothing memorable about it. He did not think about the law. He did not think about justice. He thought about the next meal, and the next mile, and the next morning when he would wake up, and the day would be the same as the day before, and he would be still alive, and still moving, and still running from something he could not name. In 1884, he returned to the territories, not to Arizona, not to the towns where the Clantons had lived, and the Earp name meant something that could be used as a weapon. He went to California. He went to the coast. He walked on a beach for the first time in his life, and looked at the Pacific Ocean, and thought about how far the water stretched before it hit anything solid, and wondered if the distance measured the space between who he had been and who he was becoming. The years that followed were the years of someone trying to become a person instead of a legend. He worked as a referee in boxing matches. He invested in mines that did not produce. He consulted for lawmen who needed a reputation to borrow and did not care about the man behind the reputation. He watched his name become a story, and the story become a myth, and the myth become the thing that young men mentioned in saloons when they wanted to sound like they knew something about the West. The thing that changed him was simple. He stopped expecting the world to make sense. He stopped believing that if you did the right thing would happen to you. He understood that the universe was indifferent, and that justice was a negotiation between the powerful and the desperate, and that the law was the agreement they reached when both sides had guns and neither side wanted to shoot. He never forgot Morgan. He never stopped hearing the sound of glass breaking in a room where his brother was sitting in the dark. He never stopped seeing the curtains that were drawn and the blood that soaked into the floorboards, and the way the body looked when they lifted it and carried it out of the room where a young man had been planning his next hand of cards. He became a different kind of man. Not the lawman who had ridden into towns believing the badge meant protection. Not the gunfighter who had stood in the OK Corral and shot 3 men in 30 seconds and called it justice. He became something that had no name. A man who moved through the world without needing it to understand him. A man who understood that the silence of empty rooms was the loudest conversation in the world, and that the only answer was to keep moving until the silence gave up and went away. In his final years, he sat on a porch in California and watched the sun go down over the hills that had no memory of the things he had done. Reporters came and asked him about Tombstone, about the gunfight, about Morgan, about what it felt like to be a legend. He answered their questions with words that meant nothing because the words were what they wanted, and he had learned that giving people what they wanted was easier than giving them the truth. The truth was simple. He had ridden into a town called Williams looking for $1,100 and found something that had no price. He found that the law was a lie told by men with guns to men without them. He found that justice was a word that meant whatever the powerful needed it to mean. He found that his brother was dead, and his brother was never coming back, and no amount of rioting or shooting or collecting debts would change any of those facts. He found that the last town he ever walked into as a lawman was the town that taught him what the word lawman actually meant. It did not mean protection. It did not mean justice. It meant that you were the man they called when the system had failed, and that when the system failed again and you went to collect a debt for a widow who trusted you, the system would let the men who killed him put a knife in his chest and leave him on a kitchen floor to die. He never wore a badge again. He never called himself a lawman again. He called himself a rancher sometimes, a miner sometimes, a consultant when the word consultant was convenient, but never lawman. That word died in Williams, Arizona in 1882, in a kitchen where a man named Fowler bled out on a floor, and a man named Wyatt Earp understood that the thing he had believed in his entire life was a story told by men who wanted other men to do the dangerous work of pretending the world made sense. He died in 1929. He was 81 years old. He was sitting in a chair on a porch when it happened. The sun was going down. The hills were the same color they had been every evening for 30 years. He did not say anything at the end. He did not need to. The silence was the only words that had ever made sense to him. If you found something in this story, leave a comment. The West has more silence than we have voices to fill it. There are other stories. Subscribe and the road will keep going.